First of all, my name is Steve Snyder, and most of you know me. I'm 58 years old. I've been married to my best friend for 38 years. In fact, we had our wedding anniversary last Friday. That's for faith, because she's been married to me for that long. I had a conversion event when I was 15 years old at a Youth for Christ evangelistic meeting. I attended Christian high school in San Diego at Scott Memorial Baptist Church. Now, the only reason that this is important is that the pastor of Scott Memorial was Dr. Tim LaHaye. Some of you may recognize that name. He's the author of The Spirit-Controlled Temperament, the well-known Left Behind series. If you go to the Bible bookstore, you'll find his books all throughout the Bible, all throughout there. And he wrote a number of other books. During my second year of high school there, Dr. Henry Morris, who is considered by many as the father of modern creation science, moved to San Diego to establish the Christian Science Research Center, which later became the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. LaHaye's son, Lee LaHaye, he now serves as CFO for Concerned Women of America, and Dr. Morris's daughter, Becky, they were in my class in high school and were my friends. Our daily chapel services featured well-known, or soon-to-be well-known, speakers from both the church and from the Creation Science Research Center. It was under the teaching of these godly men that I changed from an outspoken atheist to a confirmed evolutionist, or an outspoken atheist and confirmed evolutionist, to a believer in God and a convinced creationist. Now, my family moved away from San Diego to Florida in my junior year of high school. I graduated from high school in Sanford, Florida. Yes, it's the same Sanford that's in the news today. After graduation from high school, I left home to attend New Tribes Bible Institute, which is an evangelical Bible institute dedicated to the training and preparation of missionaries to take the gospel to the lost tribal peoples of the world. For the next 1.5 years, I attended Bible school and learned how to share the gospel, how to preach the word, and I met my future wife there, Faith. I remember a classmate who was struggling with doubts about his salvation. I recall counseling him from 1 John and praying with him. He seemed to do much better after our session together. In the years after graduation from Bible school, I became very involved in church in progressively responsible positions as Sunday school teacher, youth pastor, speaker in church when the pastor was out. I also served as a song and worship leader and eventually was appointed a deacon in a small Baptist church. After many more years of church service and active ministry around the western United States, our family settled in a small Southern Baptist church in western Colorado. With an unusual and gifted pastor who had departed from traditional evangelistic Baptist doctrines and taught the doctrines of grace from a Reformed viewpoint. Again, I was very involved in the church and eventually was appointed as one of 2 elders. One especially rewarding experience I had was to be part of a team to minister to a small Hispanic church that was crumbling under internal pressures of backbiting and gossiping members. The church was literally falling apart. The pastor asked our pastor if we would help. I helped teach a series of meetings from James on the topic of godly conversation and the sinfulness of gossip and backbiting. The ministry and intervention of our team was well received, and there was some limited success. It was a great experience seeing some lives change and respond to the teaching of God's Word. Unfortunately, our church eventually split over some doctrinal issues. I found that I couldn't follow my dear friend and pastor, and we split with a very bitter parting. I found that I was leader of a group that stayed and found myself just kind of the de facto pastor for a short period of time until the new group could regroup and select new leadership and find a new pastor. My emphasis in leading and teaching the new group was to develop a spirit of forgiveness and to conquer bitterness. In many ways, because of the ugliness of the split, I was teaching against the tide of hurt feelings and anger of people who felt betrayed. Due to a job opportunity, I moved across the state and left the reconstruction of the church in some capable hands, it was after I moved that the church found a pastor and was able to begin their recovery. Now, to summarize, I was a convert at 15 years. I sat at the feet of some of our time's greatest and most influential Christian leaders. I served as a Bible teacher, youth pastor, deacon, worship leader, and eventually elder. This is the resume of a dedicated and faithful Christian, right? Well, there's another and a darker side to this testimony. First, the constant doubts. From the time I had my conversion event at 15, I was plagued with doubts as to my salvation. Sometimes the doubts were overwhelming, and other times the doubts were like a dull ache. But the dreadful feeling of something wrong was always there. I mentioned that I helped a fellow Bible college classmate who was struggling with doubts about his salvation. Even though I was able to help him, I was never able to help myself. The verse in John 10:4, where Christ said that the sheep follow him for they know his voice, I couldn't say that I knew his voice. And I wasn't persuaded the way Paul was in 2 Timothy 1:12, where he says, "For I know whom I have believed, and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day." I couldn't say that. Now, I was counseled by some well-meaning Christian friends that some people just never feel saved, and that I should ignore the nagging doubts and just mentally assent that I was a Christian. So, I accepted that advice, and I accepted my doubts as normal. Second, there were the fears. I had numerous secret fears during my life that I usually pushed through in order to be functional. Of particular note, there was my fear of flying. After a particularly harrowing experience about 20 years ago, I could not fly without a sharp fear of flying. Takeoffs and landings were white-knuckle experiences for me. Any turbulence was accompanied by my quiet and very fervent prayers. It is interesting to look back now and see that my real core fear was not a fear of flying. I had a fear of dying. And not just the fear of the pain that comes along with dying, but I was afraid of dying and meeting my Maker. Now, about 3 years ago, Faith ordered a book titled 23 Minutes in Hell. It's by Bill Weiss. Mr. Weiss graphically portrays the demonic side of the afterlife in hell. He does a very good job of describing hell as a literal place of fiery torment. I would have Faith read me small portions of the book until I couldn't stand anymore. That was enough to torment my thoughts. At night, if I had to get up for any reason, I'd walk through my house. You know, the little light sources that you have from the coffee pot and from the computers and all that. Well, I could imagine hell's darkness with the only light sources coming from red glowing rocks. That was an image I had in my mind. I kept these fears to myself, and I tried in vain not to think of the hell described so graphically in that book. These fears were disturbing to me and relentless in their torment. Now, the third and the most incriminating item was my bitterness. Early in my marriage, I endured hurts and rejection from some people. My response to the hurts and rejection was to become angry and resentful, but quietly so. But it grew over the years into full-blown hatred and bitterness, which was toward many of my closest relatives, both my wife's side and on my side. So on the surface, I would smile, I would participate in family activities, but inside I would just seethe. As I got older, I started to be more outspoken in my attitudes. I discovered that people were relieved when I would choose to stay home. I was so full of bitterness and animosity, I didn't care what they thought. My bitterness toward family came to full light within the past 2.5 years when my wife was riding with her mom and dad and they had an automobile collision. Now, thankfully, Faith was not seriously hurt. However, in my anger, I said some very hurtful things and was rude and cruel to both my father-in-law and my mother-in-law. My words cut so deep that my brother-in-law, who's a truck driver, called from the road and expressed his anger with me and then hung up before I could respond in kind. If there was any doubts as to the depth of my anger and my bitterness, I had cleared that up for good. I was unrepentant, and I angrily declared to Faith that I would die before I would apologize. My feelings showed no sign of weakening. Surprisingly, right after that incident, the strength of my fears and the depth of my bitterness began to bother me on a new level. It seemed that whenever I would pick up the Bible, verses like 1 John that says, whoever says he's in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there's no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness, and walks in darkness, and does not know where he is going, because the darkness is blinded his eyes. And in the next chapter, John says, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. And then to make it even more clear, if anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. There were many more verses that seemed to jump out at me, but the message over and over again was that there was clear evidence from the Bible I was not saved. But I still clung to my testimony, to my conversion events, and to my past service and involvement in the ministry. Was I just a backslidden Christian with a really good spiritual resume? Please understand that all this seemed to be rising to a higher pitch over the last 2.5 years. I found myself cutting church more and more. When I did attend, my pastor Sam's sermons were very pointed and troublesome. There were times that I wondered if my wife and Sam had a plan to preach right at me when I came. It just happened so often I knew there had to be something to it. No, I'm not a paranoid person. Now I see that God was drawing me. It was a painful drawing, but a drawing nevertheless. I would like to jump forward just a couple of months to some meetings that a visiting pastor, Tim Conway, was conducting. Tim Conway is a powerful preacher from Texas who came to our church here in Denver to preach and teach at Sam's request. We were honored to have Tim and his family stay at our house for the week he preached. I attended all the meetings. His first sermon on the first Sunday was incredibly moving and clear. When he finished his message, I whispered to my wife, I'm convinced I'm not saved. And I did it in that chair right over there. That day we had a barbecue at Dorian's home. And shared with Dorian that I was very disturbed by the message and I had to meet with Sam and Tim. Remember that, Dorian? Sam and Tim agreed to meet with me at breakfast the following Saturday. The next 6 days wore on so slowly. I remember praying every morning, asking God to spare my life until I could meet with Sam and Tim. I was that worried and that convinced that if I died that week, I was condemned with no hope. Well, God was merciful, and I lived to see that Saturday morning. Both men got to the point, and in minutes I was pouring out my heart and explaining that I didn't know if I was saved. That I struggled with my assurance, and I also openly discussed my sins of anger, bitterness, and hatred. I started to explain my spiritual resume to let them know that I've been to Bible college, been a youth pastor, deacon. Tim held up his hand and he said, stop. This is only confusing things. You need to go to the basics. You need to go to Christ and seek his wisdom and leading. Christ will tell you what you need to do. My panic and confusion must have been obvious. Sam and Tim instructed me to pray non-stop in the same manner that's described in Pilgrim's Progress in a conversation between hopeful and Christian. as Hopeful describes his conversion to Christian. Now, we actually have some of those in the very back. It is titled, How to Lead Someone to the Lord Without an Altar Call from Pilgrim's Progress. Really recommend it. Breakfast was over, and Tim Conway prayed for me after we got into the car. I went home, and I went to my office, and I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed. And I kept on praying. I wrote on my calendar, and I still have the calendar. I don't let faith throw it away. It says, Please, Lord, fill me with your love, your forgiveness, your purity. Please save me. The next morning, Sunday, as Tim and his family were loading up into the car, I approached him and I whispered, Tim, nothing's happened. I'm praying and nothing's happening. Tim very quietly said, Steve, just rest and wait on the Lord. He will answer your prayer. Just relax. Relax. Okay, I will try to relax. Those who know me, I don't relax well. But I did continue to seek Christ many times a day for the next couple of weeks. And still nothing happened. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was pretty sure that it had not happened yet. So, I quietly continued petitioning the Lord. I did not share any of this with faith. None of it. I was spending time secretly in the Word, and I was praying as often as I could get away. The reason I was being quiet about this is that if I were to be saved, I wanted my life, not my tongue, to bear testimony. About 2 weeks after my meeting with Tim and Sam, I woke up after a good night's sleep, and as soon as I swung my feet out of the bed and onto the floor, I heard a strong command. Steve, you need to repent of your bitterness toward the church. The command wasn't verbal. It seemed much stronger. Now, I've neglected to tell you that for the last 10 years, maybe a little bit more, after some hurtful encounters, I've nursed a very bitter and nasty feelings toward the church. My dad had admonished me about this bitterness, and I just shrugged him off. I was comfortable that my hatred was justified. I had made bitter comments to several people that I believed the church was corrupt and blemished. That Saturday morning, I was overcome with a shame and a profound sorrow for my bitterness toward the bride of Christ. Even though I knew this verse, and I had even taught on this verse, it came to me with a pointed shout. In Ephesians 5:25, it says, Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and he gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. I found myself bowed over in prayer, confessing my bitterness, acknowledging my sinfulness, and pleading with the Lord to forgive me. When I got up from bed, my bitterness was gone. Now this was like a growth. After 2 years, now it has not returned. Instead, I have an understanding how much Christ loves his bride, and I have an intense respect for his bride, and in fact, I find that I share his love for the church. I even find I have a genuine love for the people of our church. It's good. And you too, Joe. I finished breakfast, and I drove to the far east part of Denver to run some errands, and just thinking about what had happened. Then in the parking lot of Best Buy, I heard from the Lord again. Again, not in an audible voice, but something much stronger. This time it was, Steve, I want you to go over to your father-in-law's home and apologize for your bitterness and rude behavior and ask for their forgiveness. If you remember, I had told my wife I would die before I would apologize, and I had meant it. My mind was tumbling. Oh, no. They live clear over in the western part of Denver. I reasoned I could just call, which was answered with a resounding no, go to their house. I reasoned I could send a well-written email, which again, no, go to their house. I reasoned they weren't home, as because they like to go out of town on the weekends, and they were probably not home. Again, go to their house. So I was determined that I really wanted to be obedient, so I put my car in gear, and with my mind reeling, I drove the 45 minutes to their home, secretly hoping they were not home. Well, not only were they home, their front door was wide open, and they were both in the living room. They warmly welcomed me, and I sat down and I reviewed with them my rude and bitter behavior. And I told them I was ashamed of my behavior, and I wanted Christ to rule in my life, and could they find it in their heart to forgive me, and that I would understand if they needed some time. My father-in-law got up from his chair, he hugged me, and with tears in his eyes, he says, "Of course I forgive you. I really feel bad about the accident too, and wish it had not happened." My mother-in-law also very graciously said that she forgave me, and we had a very nice visit, something that had not happened very often. Now I walked out of their house after about an hour feeling lighter. The sun seemed brighter, and the air seemed fresher. I was so happy and relieved. It had been several years since I had attended Wednesday night prayer meeting, and this seemed to be the next thing that God put on my list. So a few weeks after my meeting with Sam and Tim, I drove straight from work to church and I took a seat. People were very kind and seemed happy to see me. Faith had always attended Wednesday night, and I was curious to see her reaction when she came. She was overjoyed. In fact, she cried. I did not share anything with her at that time. I was genuine wanting to see if my life really did change. It was a couple months later, and she took my hands and she said, "You know, I really think you've got me saved." Now it's my turn to cry. I am so grateful to Christ for putting a new heart in me. I have never been good at keeping my attitudes from faith, and I've never been able to reform for any length of time before I would drift back into my angry, bitter self. Now, after 2 years, it appears my heart has actually changed. In the 2 years since my breakfast with Sam and Tim, I've seen several notable changes. I really love reading the Word. I've read the Gospels over several times, and I want to get to know Jesus better from the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm not sure which one I like the best. My bitterness is really gone. It's as if a tumorous growth was cut out, and there isn't any residual growth. I've been to a number of family gatherings, even without faith, and I actually enjoyed myself. My own parents, after a 2-day visit, asked me when I got saved. And this was unprompted and unexpected. I had not mentioned anything to them. And I don't think Faith had either. It seems that when God saves a person, He also shines through. I've flown several times in the last 2 years. On one flight, we were going through some really bumpy air. And I remember thinking, I suppose I should be afraid. But honestly, I'm not. I was kind of enjoying that. I wasn't even gripping the armrest. My fears have subsided. The only fear I have now that's significant is that I'll be one of those seeds that falls amongst the weeds, and that I'll be choked out by the cares of the world. That is a fear that I do have. I realize I need to walk daily, hourly with Christ, and not let sin carry me away. As far as my lifelong issues with doubt and lack of assurance of my salvation, I don't have those struggles. My doubts have been replaced with a calm assurance. Not a cocky arrogance, but a quiet assurance that's accompanied with gratefulness and peace. Peace. I really do have peace now. I didn't know what that was until the last 2 years. And I didn't know that I didn't know it until the last 2 years. And joy? I think I'm starting to understand how a person can go through trials and tribulations and still have joy. Now, what about all my years of ministry, of being a deacon, an elder, a Sunday school teacher? Was it a waste? Well, I've come to realize, like Paul in Philippians, when he gave his resume of being a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee, a zealous persecutor of the church, and blameless as to the law, then he says, "But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus my Lord." My own past involvement in ministry doesn't even come close to Paul's pre-conversion religious service. But I really do count all those years of service as loss. And I look forward to walking in faith towards Christ in the years to come. Finally, I looked up the word Phariseeism. The definition is observance of external forms of religion without genuine belief. Hypocrisy. After reading my testimony, I think I can say with confidence that God has redeemed a Pharisee. Thank you, Lord.